Mark had always prided himself on being an attentive husband. Over the years, he'd come to know Sarah's habits, moods, and quirks like the back of his hand. That's why, when she began to pull away, he noticed immediately. It started with the little things. The way she no longer greeted him with a kiss when he came home from work, how her laughter didn't ring out as freely during their nightly dinners, and the increasing number of late nights at the office. She used to be an open book, sharing the details of her day, but now, her responses were vague and distant. "Just another long day," she'd say, brushing off his questions with a tight-lipped smile. The intimacy they once shared had faded into something cold and mechanical, like they were merely going through the motions. Mark's suspicion grew, gnawing at him like a relentless itch. He tried to push the thoughts away, convincing himself that it was just stress, or maybe she needed space. But deep down, a dark pit of dread began to form in his stomach, telling him that something was very, very wrong. One evening, Mark decided to surprise Sarah at her office, hoping to rekindle the spark by taking her out for a spontaneous dinner date. As he walked into the building, the receptionist gave him a puzzled look, but he dismissed it. He knew his wife's routine. She should still be there, working late as usual. As he approached her office, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Voices floated out into the hallway, and he recognized one of them as Sarah's. He was about to knock when he heard something that made his blood run cold. "I can't keep this up much longer." Sarah's voice was low, but Mark could hear the strain in her words. "I'm going to file for divorce soon. It's the only way we can be together without hiding." A man's voice responded, one that Mark couldn't place, but the content was unmistakable. "I know, babe. Just a little longer. Once you're free, we can finally be together. No more sneaking around." Mark's world came crashing down in an instant. His heart pounded in his chest, his ears ringing with the weight of what he'd just heard. Sarah was planning to leave him, to abandon everything they'd built together for some affair with a man he didn't even know. He couldn't bear to hear more. Quietly, he backed away from the door, his mind reeling. Every doubt, every suspicion, had just been confirmed in the most brutal way possible. But amidst the pain and betrayal, a new resolve began to take shape within him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Sarah thought she could leave him for another man and walk away unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. The initial shock of Sarah's betrayal left Mark numb. For days, he moved through life in a daze, haunted by the memory of her words. The woman he had loved, trusted, and shared his life with was plotting to leave him for another man. It felt like a knife had been driven deep into his heart, twisting with every reminder of her deception. But Mark was not a man to wallow in despair for long. His grief slowly hardened into something cold and calculating. If Sarah was planning to discard him like yesterday's news, he wasn't going to sit by and let her do it on her terms. He had worked too hard for everything they had built together, and he wasn't about to let her walk away with half of it. Sitting alone in their bedroom one night, Mark started to piece together a plan. He knew that to protect himself, he had to be smart. Smarter than Sarah, and smarter than her lover. If they thought they could outmaneuver him, they were gravely mistaken. Mark began by quietly gathering evidence of Sarah's affair. He knew that without proof, her infidelity could easily be swept under the rug, leaving him vulnerable in the divorce proceedings. He started checking her phone when she was in the shower or asleep, forwarding incriminating text messages and emails to his own private account. Every piece of communication between Sarah and her lover became ammunition for the battle ahead. He also installed a discreet tracking app on her phone, allowing him to monitor her whereabouts and confirm the times she was with the other man. It pained him to see the truth laid bare, but every new piece of evidence only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself now, he was fighting to expose Sarah's betrayal for what it truly was, a cold, calculated act of treachery. Once Mark had gathered enough evidence to make his case airtight, he turned his attention to their finances. He knew that if Sarah was serious about leaving him, she would likely try to claim a significant portion of their assets in the divorce. But Mark was one step ahead. He discreetly met with a high-powered divorce attorney, recommended by a trusted friend who had gone through a similar ordeal. The lawyer listened intently as Mark laid out the situation, nodding with approval at the steps he had already taken. "This is a good start," the lawyer said, "but we need to do more if you want to protect yourself fully. We'll start by transferring all joint assets into your name. That way, when she files, she won't have access to any of it." Mark followed the lawyer's advice to the letter. Over the next few weeks, he moved their savings, investments, and even the title to their house into his name. He made sure to cover his tracks, making the changes appear as routine adjustments, so Sarah wouldn't suspect a thing. Each signature, each transaction felt like another brick in the fortress he was building to protect himself from the coming storm. As the final pieces of his plan fell into place, Mark felt a renewed sense of control. The man who had once been on the brink of despair was now a man with a mission. Sarah's betrayal had set the stage for a confrontation, but Mark would be the one to dictate how it played out. He would be ready when the time came, ready to face her in court, to reveal her treachery and to walk away with everything. With the evidence collected and the assets secured, Mark entered the next phase of his plan, maintaining the illusion that he was oblivious to Sarah's betrayal. He knew that the key to executing his strategy successfully was to let Sarah believe she still held all the cards. To do that, he needed to be as calm and composed as ever, despite the turmoil churning inside him. Mark's ability to mask his emotions became his greatest weapon. Each morning, he kissed Sarah goodbye with the same warmth as before, hiding the knowledge that she had already checked out of their marriage. At dinner, he listened to her stories about work, even as he mentally noted the inconsistencies in her alibis. And at night, when she rolled over to sleep, he lay awake beside her, the weight of his plan heavy on his mind. The hardest part was resisting the urge to confront her. Every fiber of his being wanted to demand answers, to make her admit what she had done. But he knew that tipping his hand too early would ruin everything. So, Mark channeled his anger into focus, refining his plan until there was no room for error. The confrontation would come, but it would be on his terms, in a place where he held the advantage. Mark also took steps to ensure that his lawyer was prepared for the upcoming battle. They reviewed the evidence together, strategizing how to present it most effectively in court. Mark's lawyer was impressed with the thoroughness of the case, confident that they would leave Sarah with no ground to stand on. But to get to that point, Mark needed to keep Sarah in the dark, and that required one final push. Mark knew that the success of his plan depended on Sarah continuing to believe that she was in control. To that end, he went out of his way to reassure her, playing the part of the doting husband to perfection. He suggested a romantic getaway, a weekend trip to the cabin they used to visit in the early days of their marriage. The idea caught Sarah off guard, but Mark could see the flicker of relief in her eyes. She thought he was trying to rekindle their relationship, unaware that he was simply giving her more rope to hang herself. "I think we could use some time alone, don't you?" he said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. Sarah agreed, albeit hesitantly, and Mark set about planning the trip. He went all out, booking the best accommodations, arranging for her favorite wine, and even suggesting they take a scenic hike, something they hadn't done together in years. On the surface, it was the perfect weekend, designed to make Sarah think that Mark was still blissfully unaware of her betrayal. During the getaway, Mark was attentive, affectionate even, feeding into Sarah's belief that she had successfully hidden her affair. They laughed over old memories, shared quiet moments by the fire, and even rekindled their physical intimacy. But for Mark, each kiss, each tender touch, was a means to an end. He was laying the groundwork for the final act of his plan, ensuring that when the time came, Sarah would never see it coming. By the time they returned home, Sarah was more relaxed, more confident that her plan to leave him would go off without a hitch. She had no idea that Mark's seemingly affectionate gestures were merely the calm before the storm, a storm that would hit with full force when she least expected it. Mark watched her closely, noting how she began to drop her guard, slipping back into her routine as though nothing had changed. Little did she know, the trap was set, and Mark was ready to spring it. The court date was approaching, and soon the truth would come crashing down around her. As the day of the court hearing approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and relief. After months of planning and sneaking around, she was finally ready to put her plan into action. Filing for divorce was just a formality. In her mind, she had already won. She had Mark wrapped around her finger, and soon she would be free to start a new life with her lover. Sarah walked into the courtroom with her head held high, her lawyer by her side. She had no doubt that the proceedings would be quick and painless. Mark had always been passive, easy to manipulate, and she fully expected him to crumble under the weight of the divorce. He would be hurt, of course, but he would also be clueless, with no idea of the affair that had been the catalyst for the end of their marriage. As she took her seat, Sarah glanced at Mark, who sat across the room looking calm and composed. It puzzled her slightly. She had expected him to look more distraught, more desperate. But she quickly dismissed the thought, attributing his calm demeanor to shock or perhaps denial. After all, he had no reason to suspect anything. When the judge called the court to order, Sarah's lawyer stood and confidently presented her case, outlining her reasons for seeking a divorce and her expectations for the division of assets. She expected to receive half of everything, if not more, given her assumption that Mark would have no choice but to comply. Sarah allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Soon, this would all be over, and she would walk away with her share of their assets, ready to start fresh. But then, it was Mark's turn to speak. As Mark rose to address the court, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense professional, stood beside him holding a thick file of documents. The judge nodded for them to proceed, and Mark's lawyer began to speak, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor," she began, "before we discuss the division of assets, we believe it is crucial to present some new evidence that sheds light on the true nature of this marriage and the reasons for its dissolution." Sarah's smile faltered. New evidence? What could they possibly have? She shot a glance at her lawyer, who looked equally surprised. But before she could fully process what was happening, Mark's lawyer began to lay out the evidence. One by one, she presented the damning pieces of information Mark had meticulously gathered over the past few months. The incriminating text messages, the clandestine emails, and the records of Sarah's secret meetings with her lover, all laid bare for the court to see. The courtroom fell silent as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Sarah's face drained of color. This couldn't be happening. She had been so careful, so sure that Mark knew nothing. But as the evidence continued to pile up, it became clear that she had severely underestimated him. "And that's not all, Your Honor," Mark's lawyer continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "In light of this betrayal, my client took steps to protect himself and the assets he worked so hard to earn. All joint assets have been legally transferred into his name, leaving the petitioner with no claim to them." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was not how it was supposed to go. She had come here expecting to walk away with half of everything, but now she was on the verge of losing it all. Her confidence shattered. She looked at Mark, hoping to see some sign of the man she thought she knew, the man who would never do something like this. But the look in his eyes was one she had never seen before. Cold, determined, and utterly resolute. The judge reviewed the evidence in silence, the weight of the documents and their implications hanging heavily in the room. Finally, he looked up, his expression stern. "The evidence presented is irrefutable," he said, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "It is clear that the petitioner acted in bad faith, and as a result, I find no grounds to award her any portion of the assets. The respondent's actions in securing the assets were legally sound, and I see no reason to overturn them." Sarah's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "The petitioner will leave this marriage with what she brought into it, nothing more." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. This wasn't just a loss, it was a complete and utter defeat. Everything she had planned for, everything she had taken for granted, was gone in an instant. She had underestimated Mark, and now she was paying the price. Mark, on the other hand, felt a sense of calm wash over him as the judge delivered the final verdict. The trap had been sprung, and the victory was his. Sarah had tried to play him for a fool, but in the end, she was the one left with nothing. As he stood to leave the courtroom, he didn't look back. There was no need. The chapter was closed, and he was ready to move on. The judge's ruling echoed through the courtroom like the final toll of a bell, sealing Sarah's fate. The gavel struck down with a resounding thud, and in that moment, Sarah's world came crashing down. The man she had betrayed, underestimated, and deceived had just walked away with everything. The house, the savings, the investments, and the dignity she had so carelessly discarded. As the courtroom began to empty, Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't just the loss of material wealth that stung. It was the public exposure of her affair, the cold realization that she had been thoroughly outmaneuvered by the very man she had thought of as weak. The shame was overwhelming, suffocating. But Mark wasn't done. As he gathered his belongings, he turned to Sarah, his voice calm and measured. "You might want to check in with your lover," he said, his words laced with a subtle, chilling finality. "I'm sure he'll have plenty of time to comfort you now that he's no longer employed." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Mark had gone further than she ever imagined. He had not only secured their assets, but had also ensured that her lover, the man she had risked everything for, was fired from their company. The full weight of her decisions came crashing down, and for the first time, she truly realized the depth of her mistake. Mark didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Sarah to face the wreckage of her life alone. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the courtroom. Mark paused on the steps, taking a deep breath as he looked out at the bustling city before him. It felt as though a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to truly feel the victory he had just achieved. It wasn't just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his future. The toxic relationship that had once defined him was now a thing of the past, and with it went all the pain and betrayal that had threatened to consume him. He had emerged from the ordeal not just unscathed, but stronger, more resolute, and ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. Over the following weeks, Mark began to rebuild his life with a sense of purpose and clarity he hadn't felt in years. He reconnected with old friends, threw himself into his work, and even took up new hobbies that had long been neglected. The shadows of his marriage to Sarah slowly faded, replaced by the bright promise of new beginnings. As for Sarah, the consequences of her actions were swift and unforgiving. Word of the courtroom drama spread quickly, and her once respected reputation was left in tatters. The affair, the deceit, the public humiliation, it all became fodder for gossip, and Sarah found herself ostracized by the very social circles she had once thrived in. Her relationship with her lover quickly unraveled as well. With no job and no prospects, the man who had promised her a new life became a bitter reminder of what she had lost. The romance that had once seemed so thrilling was now just a painful reminder of the price she had paid for her betrayal. In the end, Sarah was left with nothing but regret, a stark contrast to the life she had envisioned when she first plotted to leave Mark. The man she had dismissed as naive and powerless had proven to be anything but, and now she was the one left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. For Mark, the future was wide open. He had faced the worst and come out on top, and now, nothing was holding him back. With a final glance at the courthouse behind him, he walked away with a sense of peace and satisfaction, ready to embrace the new chapter that lay ahead. The storm had passed, and Mark was finally free, and so Mark finally gained his freedom, turning betrayal into a victory that no one could have predicted. His story is a powerful example of resilience and how determination can overcome even the most difficult situations. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the Only Stories About Men channel. Here you'll find more stories of overcoming, revenge, and triumph. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the incredible stories we have to share with you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.